They found her at first like a bird fallen from a high nest, dangling, broken, and lashed to a fence post on the ragged edge of Shattered Hollow. Evelyn Mara was the only child of Silas Mara, the stubborn rancher who'd refused to bow to the Kincaid gang's iron thumb. The Kincaids believed shattering her would shatter her father's resolve. They believed many things that turned out to be wrong. They had not counted on a drifting phantom at sunrise. Colton Hale had not spoken a word in 15 years. Not since the night fire took everything he loved. Silence had become his armor. Action had become his sermon. When the light bled red across the valley that morning, his hurry was louder than any prayer. A single movement, his knife against the rope, his hands cutting her free, and another, metal singing and men collapsing under precise and terrible gunfire. The rescue was a thunderclap, but it was only the first volley in a war that had been smoldering for a decade. What haunted Colton Hale into becoming a one-man reckoning? What memory forged the hands that carved wooden horses and the jaw that refused to speak? Before we ride deeper into this tale of blood, wood, and redemption, tell me, where are you riding in from? And if this story catches your breath, hit subscribe. There's something stronger waiting at dawn tomorrow. The first thing Evelyn felt was cool water on her cracked lips. Light sifter through eyelids blackened by smoke and tears. The stinging aftertaste of something like camphor made her gag. A woman hummed a tune low and steady, like a lullaby for a dying field. Someone's hand smoothed her hair, fingers that had known work and worry, not cruelty. Easy now, Miss Mara. The voice was sand and oak, Dr. Harlan Price, who'd sewn more farmhands back from the brink than most folks could count. You been through the devil's mouth. Evelyn tried to answer, but pain lit a white line across her jaw. Her memory staggered back in jagged pieces, rough hands, taunts, the fence's splinter biting into her shoulders until the world was a single point of agony. Then, a silhouette with winter steel eyes. The blur she had watched as a stranger moved like a shadow, but his hands moved true. He had a way of standing outside the world and stepping into it with violence that smelled like justice. Your guardian angel? Gasped Maggie Price, the doctor's daughter, hovering with a rag and a water bottle. Maggie's face was smaller than the world she'd been forced to grow into, and worry dug lines in it that hadn't been there yesterday. Harlan's boots creaked as he crossed the creaking floorboards toward the window. 3 of Kincaid's boys found dead by the fence. Clean shots, professional. Whoever saved her knows how to shoot and how to make things look like accidents. You kicked a hornet's nest, child. The Kincaids don't forgive, they don't forget. Silas Mara burst into the clinic like a storm, the old rifle trembling in his hands. Evelyn, God help me, Evelyn, he said, fingers hovering but not touching. I'll find them. I swear. Rage and fear braided into savage coils. Harlan, Silas heard, the steadiness of the doctor cutting through his reeling. She needs blankets and rest. She's got broken ribs and a concussion, and what she doesn't need is a father who rides himself into an early grave. Harlan's voice held iron in its bones. Evelyn's fingers found Silas's weathered hand, and for a moment, the old rancher looked like the boy she'd once known, terrified and tenacious all at once. Through wavering glass, she saw the ghost rider staying his vigil across the street, a man who hadn't moved since her rescue. He sat on a horse just off the dusty road, hands busy on a small block of wood, carving, whittling, shaping. Never once did he look up. Fetch the linseed oil from the back, Maggie, Harlan murmured. Silas, a word in the hall. As the men stepped into the hallway, Evelyn heard snippets of their tones. Old case files mentioned in hush, a pattern of disappearances and nearby outposts. Maggie returned with the medicine, but Evelyn's eyes stayed on the figure across the road. Noonlight slid off a tarnished badge peeking from under his coat. Somebody in town had muttered that he'd been a ranger once. Somebody else said the scars of his past had stolen his voice. The liniment slowly drew her towards sleep. As she drifted, she thought she saw him turn in his saddle and look straight at the clinic window. In his hands, the wooden shape took form. A slender horse, head arched, legs captured mid-stride. A crow cried, and a far-off thunder rolled across the endless valley. 3 days after Evelyn's rescue, Colton Hale made camp on a ridge that watched the Mara property like a wary god. His fire burned low against the chill. His coffee steamed in an old tin cup. Barely a man in a crowd now, but his hands were precise and steady over a fresh piece of wood, the knife catching the dying sun's last glints. Below, the ranch glowed with lamplight. Ranch hands moved between barn and bunkhouse, glancing at holsters like men who knew the valley had teeth. Eben Rowe, the Mara's senior hand, trotted up through the dusk, mounted and uneasy. "Mr. Hale," he said, voice trying for casual and failing. "Mr. Mara asked if you'd take supper. Miss Evelyn's asking about you." Colton didn't look up. He reached into his saddlebag and produced a small horse, exquisitely carved, oil dark from use. He handed it to Eben. "See she gets it," he said, no more than that. Eben ran his thumb across the carving's grain. "Folks are talking in town," he said quietly. "They say you used to be somebody important, before whatever took you. They say the marshal's been looking for you. They say you murdered a posse 15 years ago." Colton's oasis, hands stilled. The firelight cut his face into pale planes. "That's a lie," Eben added before he could be stopped. "Mr. Mara says he doesn't believe it, but there's talk that a U.S. Marshal rode in today asking questions." A twig snapped in the dark beyond the firelight. Colton reached and knocked his coffee cup over, smothering the flames in one practiced motion. He grabbed Eben by the arm and pulled him down behind a boulder. 3 riders materialized from the shadows, loomed slow and careful. Rifles flashed in the moonlight. "Empty camp," one of them muttered. "Spread out," another ordered. "Marshal Crowe wants him alive if possible, dead if not." Eben's breath caught. Colton's grip tightened, and the world shrank to the pressure of his fingers. The riders prowled, spoke in low economical threats, and then drifted away toward the valley after a dog barked in the dark. When the sound of hoofbeats had finally gone, Colton slipped a folded piece of paper into Eben's hand. The heading was stamped, United States Marshal. Below it, a notation, Shattered Hollow Massacre, 15 years prior. Eben folded it and stared. Colton mounted in one smooth motion and pointed his horse toward the high country. Eben watched him go, the carved horse still clutched in his palm, the paper trembling in the other. Lamps flared up below like fireflies. Someone in Broken Hollow rang the church bell. "Storm coming," someone muttered. Evelyn dreamt of rope burns and laughter. Flames woke her. She sat up, breath jagged. Light licked the horizon where Colton kept his vigil. The barn and corral were small shapes in the rain, and lamps bobbed. She made her way downstairs despite the protest of her ribs. Eben sat at the kitchen table, the small wooden horse between his calloused hands. "He's gone," Eben said without looking up. "Marshal Crowe brought men, left this." He slid the paper across. The title read the same. Evelyn turned the horse over in her hands, watching the whorls in its grain. "What's a ranger got to do with this place?" she asked. "His name was Colton Hale," Eben said. "Used to wear a star. Family killed in a cabin while he was on patrol. They burned it down. They took everything. He disappeared after that. Some say he went mad. Some say he turned hunter for hunting men who sell their office for a purse full of gun money." A commotion from the bunkhouse interrupted them. Boots pounded. Curses ripped the air. Silas burst through the door, rain plastering his hair, rifle in hand. "Riders!" he barked. "At least a dozen, Kincaid's men." Eben moved with the practiced speed of a man who'd lived with sudden need. "To the cellar with Miss Evelyn," he said. Through the window shapes pressed toward the ranch, dark silhouettes, torches and leather. Rain blurred everything into a smear of movement. Lightning lanced the sky, and for the first time the night, Colton Hale rode out of the shadow, a single black figure behind the approaching riders. Like a specter, he slipped between them and the barn. "You let the girl out, and maybe we spare the rest," called a voice from the shadow. Cass Kincaid, one of the Kincaid brothers, a man whose grin was as crooked as the valley fence. "Bring him and the quiet ghost, and we'll show mercy." The first shot came from the dark beyond the corral. A ranch hand cried out. A Winchester spat. Wood groaned. The Kincaids pressed their advantage, lobbing bottles of fire that shattered against timbers. The barn brightened with hungry tongues. Evelyn hauled her father's old Winchester up, though each movement bit into stitches and cracked ribs. She and Eben had taken a loft position against Silas's orders. Below, the ranch hands formed a ragged line. Lightning cleaved the yard, painting riders in stark white and making them seem like monsters carved from the storm. Sheriff Luther Pritchard rode slowly into the yard, his own badge catching the lamplight. "Silas," he called, "be reasonable. You're harboring a wanted man. Let us handle this by the law." Silas spat. "Which law? The kind that lets men like Kincaid burn barns to cover their tracks? The kind that paid you to look the other way?" Sheriff Pritchard's jaw twitched. He reached for his gun. Colton was already there, a shadow converging in the rain. "Should have killed me at Shatter Creek," Pritchard hissed, voice somehow calm and rotten. "After what your wife paid me to look the other way, I thought I did right." Colton's rifle sang. His shot dropped Pritchard where he stood. The sheriff's silver star skittered into the mud. There was no flourish, no speech, just the clean end of a corrupt man. Evelyn saw Cass Kincaid rearing to take aim at Colton's back. She braced, squeezed meat and wood into a single surrender of force, and fired. The angle was long, the shot not ideal, but sometimes a desperate aim finds justice. Cass toppled from his horse, and whatever order the Kincaid assault had relied upon unraveled like wet cloth. By dawn, the barn smoldered and 4 men lay dead between ash and mud. 3 of the Kincaid raiders and Sheriff Pritchard. The rest had fled into the storm, leaving shafts of rain and hoofprints that dissolved into the wet earth. Colton knelt in the mud near the collapsed sheriff, picked up the fallen badge, and left it on a fence post, as if that faint circle of metal might mark the end of something terrible. Evelyn placed the small carved horse beside it. He looked up at her. There was a softness in his eyes she hadn't been sure existed, a glimmer of something that might pass for hope. Dawn poured gold and iron across the valley. Doc Harlan tended the wounded. Silas moved among the men, barking orders and soft thanks. Smoke and cordite hung like a bad dream. Colton had disappeared at daybreak to dig 5 graves in the hard Texas soil, 1 for each of the dead. Outlaws, 1 for Sheriff Pritchard, and, in the end, he dug for the men he had once loved. He dug for the life that had been taken. Eben sat beside Evelyn with 2 tin cups of coffee. He spoke, he said low, for the first time in 15 years. 2 words, Evelyn whispered, breath fogging. "Give me the badge." She thought she heard the rough hinge of a voice that hadn't been used in years unstick itself on a single order. Maggie arrived in her father's buggy with fresh bandages and news. Marshal Gideon Crow had been seen riding north with deputies. Word spread that the Kincaids were gathering at their ranch, 20, maybe 30 guns. The valley had shifted. What had been a local feud was now a line drawn in the dirt. Silas's right arm was bandaged and his face no less set. "That's not law, Colton," he said later on the porch, watching the horizon. "That's vengeance." "She saved my life," Evelyn countered. "He saved us all. I owe him everything." Hale came down the slope with the carved horse in one hand. He mounted the porch with a slowness that looked like reverence. He presented the carving to Evelyn as if giving back a piece of a broken world. For a moment their hands brushed and something moved between them, an understanding deeper than the need for explanation. "Wait," Silas said under his breath. "We need every gun we can gather. But before we ride, tell us everything. Why Shatter Creek? Why 15 years? Why the marshal's paper?" Colton's fingers rested at his throat, where a pale white scar breached his collar. He reached into his coat and pulled out a tintype, edges frayed from years of pocketing. On it, a woman smiled with a face full of sunlight, a little girl on her lap with a wooden horse balanced on the railing. A look so ordinary it turned the stomach. Colton's voice, when he finally let it out, sounded like something rusty being turned. "My name was Colton Hale," he said. "I was marshal once. My wife, Anna, and our Katie, they loved horses. I carved them for them every night I came home from patrol. 15 years ago, a gang burned our cabin while I was away with a posse. I came back to smoke and bones. My star was bought. Men with badges looked the other way. I set out to find the ones who took my family. I have been hunting corrupt law ever since." Silas listened with the stubborn rage of a man who had known many forms of injustice, but none that matched the depth of what Colton had explained. Evelyn saw the old lines in Colton's face shift. The storm cloud of his past lifted enough to let a thin shaft of clarity through. Marshal Gideon Crow was bound in the ranch house under Eben's watch. He had ridden up with deputies, seen the aftermath, and found himself suddenly less certain of the world than he'd been in the morning. Crow had been dogged in his chase of Colton for years. a man who'd become an outlaw only in the eyes of the law that had betrayed him. Now, after the barn fire and the dead men, Crow sat quiet with questions. Colton stood near the corral, and the governor's badge had been delivered that morning by courier, a territorial commission recognizing deeds done in a gray moral zone. The badge felt heavy in his hands. He ran his thumb across it like a man checking whether a phantom was real. "It suits you," Evelyn said quietly, and she watched the storm behind his eyes begin to clear. There was work to be done. The valley would not heal by prayer alone. The Kincaids had been beaten back for now, but they were not yet broken. Their numbers were many, and the rot of bought lawmen had deeper roots. If justice was a garden, it would need tending and hands to hoe. They gathered every able man and woman on the Mara lands the next morning. The wooden horses, Colton's carved tokens, lined a fence like talismans, the little steeds watching over lances and rifles. Evelyn took one place among the defenders with a rifle not for show, but because some debts cannot be paid by talk. Maggie wrapped new bandages, Eben polished bullets, Silas trained eyes on the valley road. Colton rode with them, but remained a shadow at their edges, always where the fight might be decided. When the Kincaids came again, they rode a storm of boots and hollers. But this time, the valley answered them with a field of people who would not let greed and terror take their homes. The fight was harsh and loud. It was a syncopated dance of smoke and steel. Men who had been broken by fear rediscovered a backbone. Women who had known how to mend a man's wounds now stood with rifle and resolve. At the moment the Kincaid leader, Rhett Kincaid, charged like a thunderclap at the center of the line, Colton stepped forward. He didn't shout, he didn't plead. He pointed with a steady hand and fought like a man who had been practicing this one thing for a long time, to end the men who profit from suffering. When the dust settled, the Kincaids were routed. A few prisoners were taken. The rest fled toward scrub and canyon, wounded and humiliated. The valley's healing began in small things afterward: patched beams, new seedlings planted, graves tended. The wooden horses were set in porches and on mantles. Each carving became a reminder that life could be stitched back together. Colton took a house on the edge of town and taught the children how to whittle harmless things. He never spoke much, but where he did, his words had weight. He didn't become a saint. He didn't pretend the world had been fixed by a few gunshots, but he had made a place in which some measure of right had been restored. Evelyn worked with him on the carved horses sometimes, learning the patient rhythms of knife and grain. Her hands healed not just from wounds, but from the forging of something new. Silas kept the ranch and learned to sleep without the knot of fear that had lived beneath his ribs since the stalk. Kincaids first came knocking. Maggie and Harlan rebuilt both their clinic and their courage. Eben found a steadiness he'd never known. He became a basis under the stories everyone in the Hollow told for years. A letter came one afternoon bearing the official stamp of the territory. Marshal Crow had been stripped of office. Investigations had started into the collusion that had allowed Kincaid men to roam unchecked. Justice, slow and clumsy, turned its wheels. If you believe that some wrongs must be met by hands that do the work, not just call their names, drop a star in the comments. If you think no one so broken can't be stitched back, share this tale with someone sitting on the fence. Tell me where you live, city lights or starless country. I want to know where these stories land for you. In the soft afterlight of a late summer evening, Evelyn placed a carved horse on a fence post by the road where travelers could see it. She tied a scrap of red cloth to its tail so riders would take notice. Colton stood nearby, hands stained with wood shavings and life. He did not speak, but when Evelyn asked if he would stay in Shattered Hollow, he nodded once, a small, iron-gentle gesture that meant he would. Some nights they would sit on a porch and listen to thunder far off and not be afraid. They would say nothing, and the silence was okay because the work had been done. The fences mended, graves dug and filled. The law looked at and held to the light. The valley had been battered but not broken. The wooden horses stood like watchmen, carved reminders that healing is slow and that every honest hand helps. If this tale moved you, press subscribe for tomorrow's story. I've got one that digs even deeper into the corners where truth and memory cross. If you ride this story with me, leave a note. What would you carve into the night to remember? Drop it in the comments. Share this with someone who believes people can change. And if you want more, I'll meet you at dawn with another horse in my pocket and a star in my palm.